March 30th work session of the Portland City Council. Hope everybody's having a great day. Director Kennard, take it away.
Thank you, Mayor. Good morning, everybody. So today I put our agenda in the chat. We will be hearing from Portland Parks and Recreation, followed by the Bureau of Transportation, followed by the Office for Community and Civic Life. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Director Long to kick us off with our Parks and Recreation program.
Thank you, Director Kennard. Good morning, Mayor, Council, Community Budget Advisors. I'm Adina Long, Director of Portland Parks and Recreation, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak with you today. I will be highlighting areas of work the Bureau is doing in the city priority investment areas of equity, houselessness, community safety, economic recovery, and climate. Before we turn to those priorities, Claudio Capozano, PPNR's Finance, Property, and Technology Manager, will provide an oversight of our budget and a refresher on our Sustainable Future program. I believe we need a slideshow.
Yeah, I was just about to mention that. Is it possible for the clerk's office to be running the slideshow? That was my understanding that.
There it is.
Great, thank you so much.
You can go to the next slide. Thank you. Claudio?
Good morning. Good morning. As the director said, I'm Claudio Campuzano, Finance, Property, and Technology Manager for the Bureau. Parks and Recreation is a large infrastructure bureau managing over $1.5 billion in built assets and even more in green assets. As manager of over 15% of the city's land, our work extends throughout every corner of the city and impacts every Portlander and many others across the region who benefit from our amazing parks and recreation services. We deliver on our mission using a variety of funding sources, both capital and operating. Here, you can see an overview of our expenses by funding source. The total area of the box represents our entire requested budget for fiscal year 21-22. The reddish orange on the left represents our capital funding, consisting mostly of system development charges, bond proceeds from the 2014 Parks Replacement Bond, and ongoing resources for major maintenance of our assets. These are the resources we use to maintain our existing parks, natural areas, and recreation facilities, as well as to build new parks and amenities to meet the demands of a growing city and to close service gaps for those parts of the city that don't currently have easy access. The remainder of the boxes represent our operating funds. These are the resources we spend for the daily care of our parks and natural areas, for the operation of our community centers and pools, and for maintenance and regulation of the city's tree canopy, among many other services. The two blue boxes represent the general fund. The larger blue box above is the discretionary tax resource that we receive from the general fund, while the smaller but still large box below is our earned revenue. This consists of our program, regulatory and permit fees, our interagency agreements to provide service to other bureaus, and other revenues such as concessions and rents. The gray box represents a number of restricted funds, including fees earned for Washington Park parking that are by agreement reinvested in the park, fees associated with the implementation of Title 11 City Code, and donations for our summer events program, Summer Free for All. The yellow box represents expenses in the Golf and Portland International Raceway funds. These enterprise funds are wholly self-sufficient programs that don't rely on tax dollars. And finally, the newest entry, the green box, and you can see by its size what a game changer it is. The Parks Local Option Levy passed by voters in November 2020. This resource will help keep our parks safe and clean, restore natural areas, plant more trees, and begin the work of making our parks and recreation system welcoming for all Portlanders. Next slide, please. The Parks Levy, as we discussed during this levy supplemental budget in February, is a key piece of a long-term plan to bring desired service levels and funding into line. We call that effort Sustainable Future. For that past year and a half, the Sustainable Future program has focused on working with community stakeholders in the City Council to define a level of service for parks and recreation and investigate alternative funding options. It is through that guidance and support that we were able to secure a 5-year operating levy. The levy will address one of our most critical issues, namely affordability of programs and our structural operating funding challenge. The next big challenge to address is the gap in our capital maintenance, with an estimated $450 million backlog to fix and repair our existing parks and facilities. While we don't yet have a comprehensive plan to address this issue, Council has recognized this major challenge and has begun taking the first steps towards addressing it through capital set aside, ongoing investments in ADA barrier removal, the Build Portland program, the 2004 replacement bond, and most recently, the direction to ask each year for additional ongoing major maintenance resources. Building on these strong beginnings and developing a plan to identify additional options that address the true scale of the problem will be the work of the Sustainable Future program for the coming years. And finally, there's the capital growth gap. To follow through on our equity commitments and to keep pace with a growing city, we need to expand our system. We do have in place a system development charge program that provides significant revenue that we can use to continue to build out the park system to accommodate the growth in the city's population so that that funding gap is partially addressed. Next slide, please. It was only a few weeks ago that this council passed the supplemental budget that will allow Portland Parks and Recreation to deliver 2021 summer programming using levy resources. And it's those decisions that continue into next year that represent the biggest changes in our budget for 21-22. I know the council has seen this, but I'll recap briefly for community budget advisors. Our projections in preparation for the levy were that it would raise an average of $48 million each year, which will allow us to restore recreation programming, protect and grow nature, and invest in stronger community partnerships. In addition, in the near term, we're ramping up our organization by strengthening our support services team like workforce development, technology, finance, and communications. We're adding new staff to our equity and inclusion team and more engagement staff to bolster outreach and community partnerships. Funds from the levy are set to be collected starting in November of 2021. So this past February, we asked for $9 million from an interfund loan from our capital fund to start moving this work forward in the current fiscal year. That work continues in fiscal year 21-22. We're also using levy funds for budget stabilization, which will offset the 5% general fund cut of $3.7 million. Next slide, please. Before we move on to a priorities and outcomes discussion, I want to provide a quick review of the general fund decision packages contained in our requested budget. As I mentioned, in response to the citywide guidance to bring forward a 5% general fund cut, we have proposed that the levy resources be used to offset this $3.7 million reduction. So this line is not a change in level of service, but merely a change in funding. This request is estimated to save 34 full-time equivalent positions. Also, subject to reduction was the Bureau's allocation for major maintenance. While the levy can be used to backfill reduced general fund services, it wasn't intended to be used for capital projects. So this represents reduced capacity to deliver repair and replacement projects. Next, per city policy, Portland Parks and Recreation has requested nearly $900,000 in operations and maintenance funding to care for new and improved parks, bridges, trails, playgrounds, community gardens, and buildings that have recently been or will be placed into service in 21-22. Next, as directed by City Council in the fiscal year 18-19 adopted budget, Portland Parks and Recreation has requested a $500,000 increase in our major maintenance allocation. This request is an important tool for the Bureau to begin addressing the deferred major maintenance backlog. And finally, PP&R has requested capital set-aside resources for phase 2 of the energy savings performance contract. These projects have strategic importance, contribute to climate action goals, and result in reduced cost to the Bureau through utility savings. Next slide, please. Now I'll turn it back over to Director Long to cover how our work supports the priorities identified by City Council as part of this budget process. While all of these areas, all these priority areas are priorities in their own right, I would like to emphasize that many of the services and initiatives you'll see on the next several slides contribute to more than one priority. Most importantly, through our commitment to becoming an anti-racist organization, you will see examples of how equity plays a part in all of these priorities and all the work we do. Director Long.
Next slide. Thank you, Claudio. For each of the priorities included in the work session guidance, we'll see a sampling of services, initiatives, and associated outcomes and metrics. Portland Parks and Recreation prioritizes its services and programs to serve all Portlanders. From our lunch and play program providing food security through the summer months, to our Parks for New Portlanders program providing recreation opportunities for immigrant and refugee communities, and our youth empowerment and employment programs like our Youth Conservation Crew, which provides environmental education and vital work experiences. In addition, we're closing geographic equity gaps in service by using system development charges and other resources to build parks in underserved areas, particularly in East Portland. We are also working to grow and support a more diverse staff, translating our emergency handbook or Red Book into Spanish to make sure that our field staff have the resources they need in case of an emergency. With the Parks Levy relieving the pressure of generating revenue to provide services, we're looking at ways to remove cost as a barrier to all our public recreation services. And we'll work with community partners to actively engage BIPOC and immigrant and refugee communities to connect Portlanders to these now more accessible programs. Next slide. Portland Park and Recreation's equity metrics use level of service maps to measure progress. The one on the left represents the percentage of residents within a half mile from a developed park or natural area, and the one on the right within 3 miles of a full-service community center. Coalitions are shaded based on their level of service, with the darkest blue representing the highest level of service and the darkest orange representing the lowest. In the map on the left, we can see the lightest blue in East Portland represents residents with the least amount of access to a park or natural area, 59%. We are working to improve this, and in the past few years, 80% of our capital investment has been in areas with higher than city average BIPOC, youth, or low-income households. New parks were constructed and are underway to help address park deficiencies in areas of East Portland, including Lewitt View, Cully, Gateway Discovery, and Park Lane Parks. In the map on the right, we see shades of orange, which represent coalitions where less than half of the residents have access to a full community center. A little less than 40% of residents in the central Northeast neighborhood are being served. And in North Portland, only a little more than a quarter are within 3 miles of a full-service community center. In North Portland, level of service could be greatly increased by an aquatic center. Next slide, please. Guided by the strategies of our Bureau's 5-year racial equity plan, our workforce development efforts have helped the Bureau increase the percentage of BIPOC employees to 29%. BIPOC full-time employees increased from 17% in 2014 to 29% in 2019. During the same time, the percentage of BIPOC managers and supervisors nearly tripled, from around 10% to almost 30%. Portland Parks and Recreation has also created a racial equity lens and empowerment tool that will help us develop a consistent Bureau-wide approach to addressing inequities, create a more inclusive perspective that draws attention to how our decisions may affect underserved groups, empowers us to be deliberate, mindful, and supportive of a more inclusive workplace, and understand how all of our actions may impact others, and support our Portland Parks and Recreation team to create an intentional process for centering equity and considering what voices are not heard and who may be burdened by decisions. We have also started to develop a new racial equity statement that will guide us and remind us of who we are and our commitment to center those Portlanders who are most impacted by inequities. Next slide. As managers of the city's parks and natural areas, our staff and facilities have an intimate connection to all Portlanders, particularly our houseless neighbors. Portland Parks and Recreation provides food services, shelter, public restrooms, hygiene services, and social service referrals, to name just a few. For example, with extreme wildfire danger in our natural areas last summer, our rangers and community partners worked compassionately with campers to evacuate Forest Park and find shelter. Next slide. We've talked in great length about the role park rangers play in the former community safety work session. Interacting with Portlanders through positive and educational methods are part of the rangers' regular duties, including wellness checks, calling for medical professionals, or referrals to social services. During the pandemic, the Bureau also had 53 parks with 24/7 accessibility for hygiene, adding portable restrooms and hand washing stations. It is also routine for our community centers to serve as emergency shelters for a few days up to a week during extreme weather or poor air quality events. We would normally do this while continuing to keep the community centers open to other recreation uses. With COVID, we unfortunately had to close our community centers, but this provided an opportunity to work with the Joint Office for Homeless Services and Multnomah County to allow for temporary socially distanced shelters at Mount Scott, Charles Jordan, and East Portland community centers. While these centers are switching back to recreation services in the coming weeks to welcome youth and families for scheduled summer programming, we'll always be there in the event of extreme cold, heat, or fire. Next slide. The Park Ranger program is also a critical element of the next city budget priority, community safety. Since that program was the focus of the presentation a couple of weeks ago, today I would like to discuss and focus on other services and initiatives that provide safety to Portlanders. The ways in which we make the community safer are as numerous as the services we offer. From activating public spaces with concerts, pop-up arts and cultural events, and other community activities, to responding to emergency calls to remove downed and hazardous trees, to offering free and affordable swim lessons to make sure everyone has the skills they need to safely enjoy water sports and play, to providing safe and positive places and activities for youth to recreate. During COVID-19, we've seen the harm from the loss of these havens, especially for Portland's teens. In the last year, over a dozen past teen forest participants have been impacted by gun violence or have been arrested for alleged involvement in crime. We are thankful to Portland voters and the council's support of the Parks Levy so we can reopen critical services like Teen Force and Park Squad and bring the community back together. Next slide. The Center for Disease Control reports that Black and African-American children die from drowning at 3 times the rate as white children. 3 times. 64% of Black and African-American children cannot swim. Among white children, it's 40%. Removing cost as a barrier to swim lessons is one of the ways we can improve access. In addition, Portland Parks and Recreation is focused on outreach to BIPOC community members to ensure these valuable services are available to all Portlanders. As I'm sure everyone remembers, it was just a little over a month ago that we were covered in snow and trapped in ice. Our urban forestry operations crew respond year-round to calls, but the seasonal winds and extreme snow and ice storms make for the busiest time of year. During just the first 4 days of the storms, our crews received more than 700 emergency calls for hazards in the public right-of-way. They responded to 65 emergencies within our own parks, finding anywhere from 2 to 12 trees down in each park that needed to be cleared for safety. To date, it is estimated it will take another 2 months to finish cleaning up the damage caused by the February storms. Next slide. In a typical year, the Bureau can have more than 2,500 employees on payroll. Last year at this time, like many other public agencies and businesses, we shut down our public-facing programming and laid off more than 750 seasonal and casual staff, instead of hiring upwards of 1,000 more for the summer of 2020. This year, with the help of the Parks Levy, we will be hiring approximately 1,850 casual and seasonal staff, providing first-time job opportunities to youth and young adults from the BIPOC community. Once again, we'll be one of the largest youth employers in Portland. In addition to creating jobs within the Bureau, when we repair, renovate, and build parks and facilities, we provide work to contractors and subcontractors, many who are small businesses, women, minority, or disabled veteran owned. Next slide. According to the National Parks and Recreation Association, local park and recreation agencies across the country generated more than $166 billion in economic activity and supported more than 1.1 million jobs in 2017. Similar to community safety, many of the areas we could explore in economic recovery have been previously discussed in the infrastructure work session that occurred last week. So I will briefly mention only a few metrics, starting with our contracting relationships. In 2018-19, we contracted with disadvantaged, minority-owned, women-owned, emerging small businesses or veteran-owned construction and professional services firms at a rate of 46%, more than double the city's 20% goal. I've mentioned our seasonal hiring, and I'll also note that we'll be filling 35 full-time vacancies in recreation with the help of the levy, preserving another 34 through backfilling general fund reductions that would have impacted our workforce, and hiring 50 additional staff to really start ramping up the Parks Levy effort. Next slide. Portland Parks and Recreation staff were part of the team that helped develop the city's climate action plan and were designated to lead efforts in increasing access to local food through providing more community gardens, maintaining and enhancing natural areas for disease and pest resiliency and stormwater management, energy efficiency in our fleet and buildings, increased ecological health throughout the city through design with nature, and protecting and managing the urban forest for cooling and carbon sequestration. Next slide. One of the many responsibilities the Bureau had as part of the 2015 city's climate action plan was to implement an invasive species control program. Our Natural Areas Stewardship program was a large part of that work. The program works with volunteers of all ages to restore and enhance our parks and natural areas. Thanks to the efforts of volunteers, partnerships, and mentorships, you can see the tremendous amount of effort that is put into removing invasive vegetation and planting native trees and plants, in addition to removing litter and building and maintaining trails and fences. Unfortunately, the pandemic forced the cancellation of 203 events scheduled for 2020. Following safety guidelines and social distancing, the program will be hosting events again, and we are grateful to all our volunteers and partners who have continued to care for Portland's natural areas throughout this very challenging year. Next slide, please. Urban forestry management is a large part of our fight against climate change, and as you will see from this slide, an important piece of our equity work too. Much of the work being done is in service to growing and maintaining a healthy tree canopy for all Portlanders, and through the creation of a citywide tree planting strategy to promote equitable access to trees and urban forest services through tree planting efforts. You may remember seeing the map on the left in previous presentations. It reminds us that overall, nearly 31% of the city has tree canopy coverage, but that coverage is not equally spread throughout Portland, with east of the Willamette River being 21% or close to the same as Los Angeles. One way we are working to address that disparity is through our yard tree giveaway program. More than 3,000 trees have been given away over the last 4 years. 2020 was the largest year for the program, with more than 1,200 trees finding new homes in private yards across the city. Focused outreach was conducted in neighborhoods designated low canopy, low income, or both, and 72% of the trees were given away to residents in these neighborhoods. The map on the right highlights the results of these efforts. Areas with shading are neighborhoods where residents received trees. The bright yellow areas are where the most trees were given away. You can see especially large clusters in Hazelwood and Lentz neighborhoods. It's also important to note that 88% of the trees given away this year were either large growing, evergreen, or native, all of which provide the most benefit to us and wildlife. Next slide. It's been a very busy year for Portland Parks and Recreation, and I'm proud of the way my team has stepped up to provide important services to the community during a global pandemic. As we look ahead, we've been thinking a lot about Bureau planning as we've been wrapping up and summarizing our existing plans. Internally, we've launched a new Healthy Portland framework to guide us. The goal can only be achieved if our services, programs, parks, and facilities are provided equitably to all Portlanders. We are committed to doing a better job of consistently engaging internal and external communities in our planning processes and sharing back information about how we're using what we've learned. This is how we'll build trust and accountability, change the culture of the organization, and empower our community. It's how we become the organization we want to be. Next slide. Like many of our sister bureaus, Portland Parks and Recreation is prioritizing equitable service delivery at the same time as we are working toward a longer-term financial sustainability. There is a clear connection between the city's identified priorities and the core work being done at Portland Parks and Recreation. Many critical services are being funded by the Parks Levy, which you supported as a first step in building a sustainable future for the Bureau. Thank you. While we do our best to take advantage of the near-term opportunities, we will continue to search for and develop capital investments and more permanent funding for long-term solutions. There is still so much work to be done. The Bureau is grateful for the support that City Council has given us and the trust the public has shown us. We look forward to continuing this important work in partnership. I'd like to open the floor now for any questions, and I have Todd Lufgren and Claudio Campuzano today to assist with answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Mapps.
Thank you for that presentation. I have two questions that basically explore spaces where the parks budget proposal is out of line with the recommendations we are receiving from the budget office. And I find two examples of this that struck me. So for example, I believe Parks is requesting about $866,000 to fund operations and maintenance at new parks. The budget office is recommending $0 for this line item. I was wondering if maybe the budget office could explain what they're thinking, and then maybe Parks could come back with a rebuttal.
Sure, I'm happy to. Thank you, Commissioner Mapps, for that question. I am going to see if we have our analyst on the line. If Robert Cheney is on, I'll give him the opportunity to speak.
I am here.
Great, thanks, Robert. Would you like to explain a little bit of CBO's recommendation?
Sure, yeah. So my name is Robert Cheney. For the record, I'm a CBO analyst for Parks and Recreation. The principle that CBO is standing on in that recommendation was that when Parks referred the levy to voters, some of the language in the referral mentioned that that resource would be available for maintenance and other land stewardship initiatives. So given that, Parks is now in a little bit more of a resource rich environment, and that resource hasn't been programmed out, as a lot of the new levy resource will be coming and be programmed out in the fall supplemental budget. We believe that there is ample time to kind of plan that resource and for some of this new money coming online to be programmed into operations and maintenance of new parks. Beyond that, I would say CBO also notes that we recommend that the whole operations and maintenance of new parks assets coming online is an issue that should be revisited by the council in general, as there is timing issues between new assets coming online and funding of operations maintenance for those assets. We can happy to chat more about that, but that's a little bit of an aside.
Great. I'd like to hear Parks's perspective on that too.
Good morning, everybody. This is Todd Lofgren, Deputy Director, Portland Parks and Recreation. just maybe highlight two things. First is just the basic principle as we develop and build new assets in the park system, it's really important that we care for them once they're built. So one way or another, hopefully we'll all agree on that principle, and that either the general fund or the parks levy is appropriate allocation of resources. And that we've heard in past, both from community and from the council, of building new things and then not being able to care for them isn't a good option. But the source of funding, the parks levy is a viable alternative from the general fund on a temporary basis, recognizing that the parks levy is a 5-year funding source, not a permanent source. And in the past practice, when we've had operation and maintenance funding added to the parks budget, it's done on a permanent basis. And so while this can be a 1-year solution by using the parks levy, we just need to keep an eye to the future for the long term.
Thanks, Todd. And if I may, can I ask one more question? It comes in the same format. Parks is asking for $2.7 million for energy efficiency investments at the East Portland Community Center. I think I've looked at this project and it seemed kind of cool. At the same time, the budget office recommends $0 for this. Maybe, I'm guessing, Robert, can you explain to us what the budget office was thinking here, and then maybe we can go back to parks. You're on mute.
Thanks. Absolutely. So that package was submitted into the capital set aside process, which for folks basically means that every year we calculate a general fund ending balance. We take half of that balance and we allocate it to capital projects. That process undergoes a pretty rigorous scoring and benefit cost analysis and whatnot. I believe the pot of money that project was competing against this year was $4 million. It was a lot smaller than it used to be. And we know the project scored highly. It is a great project. I fully acknowledge it. Unfortunately, there was a couple other projects that presented more like legal pressures and presented more legal liabilities. As well as just scored higher on our benefit cost ratio analysis in that process. So the recommendation says nothing about the kind of the merits of the project, because it clearly is a very great project. It was just competing against a couple of projects that presented more immediate exigent legal liabilities and other factors.
All right, thanks, Robert. Does Parks want to respond?
Yeah, this is Claudio Campuzano responding. Yeah, absolutely. Agree with Robert. It was a very small pot of capital set aside resource this year. This is phase 2 of a project. We've got actually close to $50 million worth of projects queued up. These are great projects, amazing triple net bottom line. And they really hit on all cylinders in terms of climate action, sustainability fiscally for the Bureau, and the first phase is in flight right now, and is probably going to be saving us several hundred thousand dollars a year in utility savings alone. So really excited about moving these forward over time. They're for the most part not time sensitive, but as we see other resources that might become available for these types of projects, we'll certainly be looking to council for support on those, such as the new federal stimulus, or potentially as the PSEP grows, and we can work with community partners to deliver on some of these projects. That would be ideal.
Great, thank you very much.
Rita, good morning.
Good morning. Before I ask my questions, I want to thank the Parks Bureau. They have been one of the bureaus that's worked very collaboratively with our high school in East Portland, helping get youth in jobs, as well as developing a community garden, as well as thanking them for their investment in parks in East Portland that was greatly needed. Mine are kind of odd questions, and I'm not sure who would answer them. The first has to do with capital improvements. And I know with the SDCs, and I'm not as familiar as the intricacies on SDCs, but I know it's for expanding. But I also know that from a capital standpoint, having to redo a total roof is a capital expense, but it appears it falls under the maintenance. And I was wondering if there's something with stopping SDC funds from being used on some of these major capital projects that are necessary in the park. And then a second question I had with the new levy, is that going to be constricted by compression, that some of our levies are constricted in our taxing? And the third one having to do with tree canopies is, I know for a fact, I've been in Portland a long time, as a one time with the zoning development that was done, they could just tear out all the trees, and trees weren't preserved. In fact, I had a zoning person years ago when I first got involved complain about East Portland wanting to keep its trees in its parks and stuff and in the area. So has the zoning change that requires developers to keep some of that tree canopy rather than stripping the land of the trees? They're kind of different issues, and I'm not sure who should answer them.
Well, this is Claudio. I'll jump in for the first two, and I'll turn to Adina or Todd for number three. So the first question about SDCs, you got it right. SDCs are a charge that we charge for new development, and it's intended to create new capacity in the system to manage the size and density that the city gains as a result of those new units and new commercial activity. So the state law prohibits us from using it for major maintenance activities. And so really we can only use it for capacity increasing activities. We have used it to leverage other major maintenance funding. So for example, we've added lighting and turf to fields as part of renovations to fields. So we'll be able to renovate the field with other resources, and we'll be able to add lighting and turf with SDCs. And the idea there is that we're extending the time of year and the time of day that we can use those facilities, and so that's capacity increasing. So we've been really creative with SDCs, but there's a limit to that creativity that state law sort of limits us to. The second question that you had about compression, yes. The local option levy will also contribute to compression to the degree that it exists on certain properties, and for those that know the stuff, I know that it's very wonky. There are now 3 local option levies in the city of Portland: ours, Metro, and the Oregon Historical Society. I'm sorry, now the fourth one, so we're the fourth one. The children's levy is the third pre-existing one. And so our local option levy will compress those first, and then to the degree that that properties are still in compression, then other levies would be compressed as well. But for the most part, the big impacts would be on the other levies. As part of the run-up for the referral, we did analysis. We hired PSU to help us figure out what those impacts would be, and we wrote into the referral language and into the ordinance that we would be making whole the children's levy and work to mitigate impacts on the other 2 levies, recognizing that. We're not trying to put our hands in other people's pockets. We're trying to grow the pie altogether, to use a couple of metaphors. So does that help at all?
Yes, if it's state law, sometimes we need to revisit state law. It might be worth something advocating to expand, because redoing a roof totally is a major capital expense versus a maintenance item. So it seems like STCs might be an avenue, but it sounds like state law needs to have some tweaks to it before that can be done. And yes, you did answer those 2 questions. The third one had to do with the zoning and trees, because that's been a real big issue in East Portland on multifamily private developments where they could raise the trees down and there'd be no greenery. So that I was I thought there was some changes, but I wasn't sure.
So,
I agree.
sorry to jump in. I'm getting pinged from Director Kennard. We've got a lot to cover today. And there's several people who have their hands raised. So could I ask that we keep questions limited specifically to budget as opposed to policy questions? And could I ask staff to answer as succinctly and directly as possible? Frida, did that answer your questions?
Those answered my questions, and they can put the other question answer in the chat or send it to me later. It's not a big problem.
Yeah, good, awesome. Next up is Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Parks Bureau. Two quick questions. One, we learned a couple of years ago and ongoing that there are people that are willing to pay more to be able to participate in our parks programming. And I didn't hear anything or see anything in your written documents about what you're doing to create a sliding scale so that people that are able to pay more will. And so just want to know if that work is in progress. And then my second question is more about this summer. I think that you have a plan to have swimming this summer, which I think is really unlikely considering that we are still in the midst of COVID activities. And as we see, the numbers are going back up because people are relaxing. So if not swimming, then what? And then it begs the question of, are we hiring too many people for programs that we won't be able to do this summer?
Thank you, Commissioner, for those questions. I'm going to make a stab and then ask for my very deep bench to jump in if I missed anything. To your question around the sliding scale, yes, we are developing a process. We're referring to it as pay as you can, in the hopes that folks who are able to pay the traditional fees and rates for our programs will do so, and those that have barriers or unwilling or unable to pay those fees will pay what they are able to. So yes, that is in progress. Then your other question regarding swimming. Currently, the Oregon Health Authority, as well as the Oregon Parks and Recreation Association, is allowing swimming in a very controlled way. So, and what we're planning is timed entry, only lap swim and instruction, no sort of open play, right? And then we'll also hopefully be able to do some aquatic fitness. We have been, over the last year, had to be incredibly nimble in changing our direction and our restrictions around what folks can and cannot do in our parks. And we are poised to continue to do the same heading into the summer. We meet constantly and try to interpret the guidelines, the ever-changing guidelines, as best we can. Similarly, we are currently hiring seasonal staff that are mostly primarily working out of doors. So our environmental education camps, our recreation camps are all outside. And we're going to continue our fitness in the park program, which we started during COVID. So that is outside as well. So we are taking that into account, but I appreciate the questions. Did I miss anything, Todd? All right.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. Does that answer your questions? Okay, good. Andrea, you're up, then Show.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, thank you for the presentation. I just know from a couple of years ago that Parks had an issue with having quite a number of their employees classified as seasonal or temporary who had worked for Parks for years. And I was wondering, if you don't have the information today, it's fine, but just in general, if the presentation, if we can find out kind of what the status of that is, but also if the presentation going forward can include more information about internal equity efforts to ensure that the staff at Parks are being properly classified and receiving adequate pay and benefits as a result.
Yeah, I'm happy to give you more information on that. just give you a kind of broad sense. We have about 600 full-time employees at Portland Parks and Recreation. And just for the summer, to give you a sense of scale, we'll have 1,850 seasonal casual employees that will be on the team. And we're definitely always looking for different ways on how to make sure our seasonal casual team members are supported. So happy to give you more information as you need it.
Great. Show, you're up.
Hey, Show, you're on mute.
Community gardens, how many gardens do you have now? Do you intend to expand that program on the east side?
We currently have 59 community gardens citywide. I know that there are plans to expand the gardens, and I don't have specific locations for you, but I'm happy to find those and send them along as a follow-up.
And what's the budget for the community gardens? How much does it cost to the city to support that program?
Again, I would not have that off the top of my head again, but we can get that information to you, Show.
Thank you.
Very good. All right. I think that completes the questions, Director Kennard.
Thank you, Director Long and team. We'll now turn it over to Director Warner from the Bureau of Transportation.
Great. Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Okay. Is the slideshow up? Or... Awesome. Thank you so much. Mayor, Council, Community Budget Advisors, thank you for the opportunity to discuss PBOT's requested budget. I'm Chris Warner. I'm the Director of the Portland Bureau of Transportation. Next slide, please. At PBOT, we are the steward of the city's streets, sidewalks, bike lanes, and trails, and we are dedicated to helping all Portlanders get to where they need to go safely, easily, and sustainably. To fulfill this mission, our 6 business groups offer programs and services that range from technical support, focus on specific stakeholder groups, for example, our construction services, to broad community-based initiatives that are designed to be enjoyed by all Portlanders. Our Block Party program is a great example of the second type. As you can see from this slide, not only is there significant diversity in terms of who we serve, but there's also a wide variety of types of services that we offer. These services range from emergency response and taking care of our infrastructure to consumer protection and long-range planning. Next slide. Another central aspect of our work entails operating and maintaining over $16 billion in transportation assets. Our portfolio encompasses everything from small but vital pieces of infrastructure like street signs to large-scale systems like our streetcar and our lighting that are valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Next slide. How we deploy our resources and capacity is shaped by moving to our future, our strategic plan. The plan has 3 main goals which reflect what Portlanders have told us as their top transportation priorities. This slide presents key performance measures related to these goals. We're using moving to our future to elevate our work on equity. All of our goals are framed by transportation justice, which is a reflection of both what we've heard from the community and the City of Portland's overall commitment to achieving a just distribution of resources, access, and opportunity, starting with issues of race and disability. In pursuing a more just transportation system, we have 2 aims. First is to build a system that is accessible to all Portlanders, and second, we need to help Portland significantly shrink its carbon footprint. As you can see, that's one of our key performance measures from this slide. Next slide. Our increased commitment to equity and anti-racism is reflected in a number of ways. In our budget, we propose investing $250,000 for equity programming, such as our Equity Innovation Fund, which will support the development of cutting-edge equity tools. And we're also moving forward in partnership with BPS with the work of the Pricing Options for Equitable Mobility Task Force. Convened at your direction in 2019, the task force has drafted an equitable mobility framework and is currently formulating policy recommendations for how we can use pricing strategies that will support the goal of delivering safe, reliable, and affordable transportation options to all Portlanders. The recommendations being developed also specifically consider the impact of the pricing on Black and Indigenous people, other people of color, low-income drivers, and persons with disability. Next slide. Another key initiative related to both transportation justice and safety is our request for funding to support our Lighting Portland for Safety program. National research tells us that street lights save lives. If an intersection is well lit, it can reduce crashes by close to half. We've seen similar results here in Portland. Where we've improved lighting at intersections, we've seen a 42% reduction in crashes. The Lighting Portland for Safety program is such a high priority for us because the unfortunate reality is that many of our most dangerous streets, what we call our high crash corridors, don't have adequate lighting. Many of these corridors are located in East Portland. By using the additional savings of installing LED bulbs, which are much more energy efficient, we were able to develop a plan that added street lighting to our high crash network. Council approved this plan as part of last year's budget process. Unfortunately, a 5% reduction nearly eliminates those savings. By restoring just over $335,000, we will be able to quadruple the number of lights we install. The investment by City Council at this time will also allow us to leverage other funds to deliver all 1,800 lights that we have promised to the community. Next slide. Many Portlanders are familiar with our $4 billion maintenance obligation. They experience it as bumpy roads, lighting outages, temporary road closures, delays in service, and other transportation challenges. We know that Portlanders expect and deserve better. We're pursuing a better transportation system by doing two primary things. One, maintaining our assets more effectively and efficiently, and two, searching for new revenue sources. As examples of using more and better innovative asset management techniques to reduce costs, we continue to partner with the Bureau of Environmental Services to coordinate repaving and installation of curb ramps following sewer work. This provides full street improvements for the cost of delivering curb ramps through coordination with our sister bureau. We're also working with utilities to improve coordination on projects to reduce impacts to the transportation facilities, as well as the frequency of construction delays to Portlanders traveling from place to place. On the funding side, Build Portland and Capital Setaside represent two critical sources of maintenance funding. These resources help us address our failed roads, bridges, and signals that are otherwise too costly to be funded by our general transportation revenue alone. Additionally, we are investing approximately $19 million per year in pavement preservation and about $1.5 million a year in bridge maintenance. And as we emerge from the pandemic and recover from the recession, we see our efforts to bridge this gap as a critical way for PBOT to support the economic recovery and put more Portlanders back to work. Next slide. This year, our capital set-aside requests are $1.7 million for curb ramps to support the creek settlement, $3 million to improve signals and lighting. This includes $1 million for improvements at Southeast Foster at 110th and 111th, and $2 million for West Burnside at 2nd and 3rd Avenues. We're also asking for $2 million for paving on Northeast Cornfoot Road in Northeast Portland. These projects were identified and evaluated based on their social, environmental, and financial benefits. In calculating these benefits, we also considered the consequence for failing to fund this maintenance work. Among the benefits we considered were the improvements in safety that come from better signals and lighting, the increased mobility and accessibility that ADA compliant corners deliver, and the more robust economic and commercial vitality associated with improving a key logistics corridor near the airport. All of these requests address the critical maintenance needs and help us address our maintenance backlog while delivering on the city's and our Bureau's values. Next slide. The pandemic has shown a harsh spotlight on the deep disparities in our society. Certainly one of the most visible signs of these disparities is our ongoing failure to make sure all Portlanders have a roof over their heads. PBOT remains committed to supporting City Council's efforts to address our homelessness crisis. The steps that we are taking include, we're investing over $650,000 in our program to address people living in derelict RVs. We're investing $1.2 million in the Homelessness Urban Camping Impact Reduction Program. This slide shows a cleanup that we supported off of Northeast Halsey under Northeast Cesar Chavez. We're reducing the permit fees for affordable housing development and reducing the utility vault lease rate for qualified affordable housing projects. We're also funding our innovative transportation wallet program for residents who live in affordable housing. And we're also absorbing significant costs to repair damage to our bridges from fires that have started through homeless camps underneath them. Next slide. The fiscal fallout of the pandemic and the recession that is accompanying it has been severe and forced us to make some tough decisions about where to find savings. As we reduce costs, I directed my staff to follow these priorities. First is to minimize the impact on our strategic and transportation justice goals. I wanted to preserve existing workforce, prioritize existing assets over new projects, prioritize smaller safety and capacity improvements over large capital projects, find efficiencies in the work we do, and very importantly, stabilize our long-term financial picture. Our proposed budget has met these priorities, including improving our long-range financial outlook. The cuts that we have made have reduced our long-term deficit by $96.7 million. Saying that, it's important to note that there will be impacts on our programs, our service levels, and our ability to perform routine maintenance. For example, it will take us longer to install new parking meters, fill potholes, respond to residents' requests for small-scale safety improvements. Just a few examples. Next slide. These cuts have helped us improve our long-term financial forecast. As you can see, before the pandemic, our long-term budget forecast fell into deficit in the year 2027. The pandemic accelerated this day of reckoning to the fiscal year 2025. Now, with the measures we have taken, we have stabilized our financial foundation. We've done that in two ways. First, as I mentioned, we've reduced our long-term deficit by $96.7 million. And second, we've delayed its onset until fiscal year 2028. That's the good news, but it is not a permanent solution. But we have made significant work. We have done significant work to reduce our long-term liability. And what we need now is to talk about how we implement new revenue sources to make sure we can successfully address our structural deficit. Next slide. In addition to our $4 billion maintenance gap, this slide details some of the most significant long-term risks and liabilities we face. I'll talk about just a couple of them. First, you are familiar with the city's ADA settlement, requiring 1,500 ADA compliant curb ramps installed or improved annually through 2030. Our maintenance facility, known as the Kirby Building, is an old and failing facility that houses nearly half of PBOT's workforce, our field crews. It is a converted parking garage whose yard, where we keep our vital equipment, is under a seismically challenged ODOT facility. It's hard to imagine our front lines helping to clear streets and inspect structures, but not being able to muster to work through their own facility or use the debris clearing equipment that could potentially be trapped under a portion of I-5. The refurbishment of our streetcar vehicles would preserve the cleanliness, safety, and service Portlanders have expected of our system. Most of our bridges were built in the 1970s before present day seismic standards were enacted. To retrofit our 152 bridges to meet current seismic safety standards, that would require an investment of about $750 million. And just for good measure, Portland's harbor wall is currently in good condition, but will require major maintenance and rehabilitation in the next 25 years. Next slide. It's no exaggeration to say that our financial transportation model is broken. For decades, the fuel tax has been the backbone of our business model, yet we can't depend on the viability of this revenue stream. First, it's not clear whether and if the legislature will approve another fuel tax increase after the increases that were part of the 2017 state transportation package. There's an even greater uncertainty, though, as it relates to the long-term incompatibility between a transportation system based on fossil fuels and combating climate change. Cars are getting more fuel efficient, and more of the vehicle fleet is turning towards hybrid or electric vehicles. From the standpoint of our health of our climate, these are very necessary change, and we fully support them. At the same time, they contribute to the potentially lower fuel taxes, and that drives us to find alternative funding sources if we are to maintain the long-term viability of our programs and services. This slide shows some of the proposed ways to supplement, even replace fuel taxes that we and others in the transportation sector are exploring. All of these have their unique advantages and disadvantages, and of course, implementing them will bring a set of political and policy challenges. However, given the fundamental role that transportation plays in making our economy work and supporting the vitality of our city, we have to find a lasting solution for long-term transportation funding challenges. Next slide. Before I close, I want to highlight some of the fantastic work that our employees have been able to accomplish. It's been a very difficult year, but our people remained resilient and rose to the challenge. Our personnel in the field, as I said, nearly half of our workforce, after adjusting to work protocols to make them COVID safe, kept our transportation system up and running. They performed critical maintenance and repair work on our roads, traffic signals and meters, continued to enforce parking rules, kept the streetcar running, and delivered programs for Portlanders that Portlanders rely on, like Leaf Day. We also saw the dedication to their jobs, and that was really highlighted by the recent work of the round the clock for the storm we had last month. We found creative ways to adjust popular programs to the reality of the pandemic. We turned Sunday Parkways into a giant digital dance party and exercise regime throughout the summer. We continue to encourage school kids to enjoy biking and walking through safe routes to school, including COVID-safe pop-up exercises on our playgrounds. We even delivered a major transportation improvement to the existing Biketown program, which now features an all-electric fleet and has expanded its service for the first time to parts of East Portland. In addition to this inspiring work on our traditional programs and projects, our employees answered the call to support the city's pandemic response. We created the Safe Streets program, a multifaceted initiative to rethink our street and sidewalk space to help Portlanders shop safely, how to exercise and travel through the pandemic. Our Healthy Businesses program, which allows businesses to use street space for commercial activities, has allowed over 1,000 businesses to expand their operations outdoors since last summer. As one business owner told us, without these outdoor seats, we would have closed and there wouldn't have been a penny for anyone or the jobs of the 50 people that are working now. PBOT staff were also active participants in the city's Emergency Coordination Center since the start of the pandemic. With the support of the CARES Act funding, we partnered with Multnomah County Public Health to create a public messaging campaign on Black Portlanders, one of the communities hardest hit by the pandemic. Finally, I'm happy to say in the next day or two, our maintenance crews will complete the first cycle of our gravel street service, an initiative which addresses the long-standing problem of potholed gravel streets in the city. Thanks to these efforts and your support, the days of Portlanders having to navigate pond-sized holes in order to get to and from their homes are finally over. We don't know what normal will look like when we fully emerge from the pandemic, but I do know that with your continued support, we will look forward to expanding our efforts to use our transportation system to make our city safer, more sustainable, and fairer for all Portlanders. Thank you, and every day, PBOT works to connect people to places that they want to go. We have designed our budget in support of this goal through an efficient, equitable, and transparent use of public money. Now we'd like to provide some time for members of our Bureau and Budget Advisory Committee to address you. I believe that Momoko Sanders and Doug Armstrong are here, and I'll have them take it away.
And thank you, Chris Warner. Firstly, I just want to say that I'm excited to, and I hope that you all are able to support the Lighting Portland Safety Initiative and ADA CURP RAM programs by allocating general funds and capital set aside funds for these programs. By supporting them, it speaks to your priorities, and it is heartening to see that safety and accessibility. These programs will help to encourage active transportation in East Portland and while also creating safer streets. To speak more specifically about the importance of investing in East Portland safety initiatives, I invite Doug Armstrong to speak. He's a member of BBAC, the chair of East Portland Land Use Transportation Committee, and is also an East Portland resident. Doug, please go for it.
Thank you, Momoko. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. I'd like to parrot what Momoko said. We appreciate the support in East Portland. in the initiatives put forward by Director Warner to save our streetlights. That is a critical infrastructure challenge that we have in East Portland. And I am grateful for the council's looking into that and making sure that that part of the budget stays intact. It's an interesting note that of the accidents that have happened in East Portland that have involved pedestrians or bicyclists, almost half of those accidents occurred on streets that had inadequate lighting. Also, in reference to the BBAC's letter to council, street maintenance is an important component of our streets in East Portland. It's basically how East Portland survives without capital investment. We get maintenance dollars that come in to fill cracks and holes and potholes. And like I said, it's basically how we survive here. That is not to take away from the hard work that PBOT does do. There are 12 separate capital projects that will be occurring this year and next year in East Portland to complete out the East Portland in Motion plan and bring forward the East Portland in Motion 2 plan once it is fully figured out and visualized and listed down. With that, if any of the council have questions, I would be happy to entertain those.
Great, thank you, Doug. Frida has, Sho, you have your hand raised, or is that from last time?
One question about the aerial tram. What's the net cost to the city versus OHSU's picking up the cost for aerial tram?
Thank you. I think you asked about the aerial tram. Yeah, there's no GTR that goes into that. That is all funded internally through our agreement with OHSU and that work. So there's no GTR that goes into that.
One other question on leaf pickup fee, was it fairly controversial some years ago? Is that still going on?
Sho, we can't hear you. Can you turn off the video for a second?
Leaf pickup?
Yeah, I think Sho asked about Leaf Day. So yeah, thank you for the question. So initially we had there was a fee that was associated with the leaf fee. What we found is that over the years we had many people weren't paying. We also had really trouble tracking it. So part of the issue was when you if you didn't pay the fee, then we had to track who paid and who didn't, and it became really kind of a logistical challenge for us in terms of figuring that out. So within the last year or so, we just went ahead and absorbed that into our budget. Number one, because we weren't recovering nearly as much money as we initially were, and then second, was really hard to track in terms of who was paying and who wasn't. And as part of the measure, it said we had to refund. We couldn't charge people who took care of their own leave. So, but we had a really hard way of tracking that. So it overall, it was a bit of a budget hit, but it also made it easier and for us to actually get the work done.
Thank you. Frida, then Commissioner Mapps.
This is in regard because PBOT's a lot project-based in their funding and stuff. Are you aware that the state legislatures have been asked to submit a list of projects to, I guess with this recent COVID money, that they're going to look at projects based within areas? I happened to have a meeting with state legislators for East Portland, and we were looking at housing and transportation. So I didn't know if the city and PBOT were reaching out to the various legislators to see if they could get projects placed on this list for possible funding.
Yeah, I will. Our government relations folks have been in constant conversation with many legislators. But yeah, so we would certainly encourage any and all funding that we can get. So we'll definitely follow up with that. Thank you. For that.
Okay, it's very time sensitive. They have to turn in their projects by this Friday.
Okay.
So.
Yeah. I spoke with a couple of East Portland legislators over the weekend, so we'll make sure that we'll get on that. Thank you.
Commissioner Maps.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Director Warren, Doug, and Momoko for your presentation. Today, I want to continue to explore spaces where the budget office disagrees with recommendations or requests that are baked into the Bureau's budget request. And there are two examples that I'd like to explore a little bit. One is the Healthy Business Program, and the other is Northeast Cornfoot Road. Why don't we start with the Healthy Business Program? PBOT has asked for $3.5 million for the Healthy Business Program. This is that program that allows us to all eat out on the streets, and we love it. At the same time, the budget office is recommending $0 for this program. Could someone from the budget office give us some intuition around your recommendation? And then I'd love to hear PBOT's reaction.
Sure, I'm going to turn it over to Shannon Fairchild, who's our analyst assigned to work with the Bureau of Transportation.
Hi there, thanks for the question. So in terms of the Healthy Business Bureau, that request, we're not recommending general fund resources, but we are recommending the ARP resources, and that's largely a result of just there's limited general fund resources available, and it is a one-time need that the Bureau is requesting. I would also just note part of the analysis highlighted that a significant portion of the $3.5 million request was for lost revenue from parking meters. So for permit holders that are occupying a space in a metered parking spot, the Bureau was estimating that would be about 1.3 million in revenue. And so if that was not to materialize, if recovery doesn't achieve at the level that they're estimating, that would be a significant amount of resources that would go towards something that wouldn't necessarily materialize. Did you also ask about Cornfoot, or would you like me to talk about that in a moment?
Actually, I'd like PBOT to respond to the business program, and then we'll get to Cornfoot.
Thank you, Commissioner. And we acknowledge that it is our hope that the ARP funds can be used for the Healthy Business Program. And I know that we've had discussions, so we accept Shannon's recommendation, but we are hopeful that we can get it funded through the ARP, because it has been, I think, a very necessary program for the city to move forward. And it is basically coming out of my bottom line, because those people would be doing other things, but we've focused all of their efforts on there. So in a way, I can't afford to do it, but I also can't afford not to do it. So I'm very focused on trying to make sure we provide that service for Portlanders.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Director. And let me do my last question. Cornfoot Road. Let's start with the budget office. PBOT has requested, depending on your count, between $2 and $10 million to pave about 1.5 miles of road, Cornfoot Road, and the budget office is recommending $0 for this project. Could the budget office explain to us what you're thinking?
Sure. So PBOT submitted 4 projects for funding. We are recommending funding 3 of them. So that includes the ADA compliant curb ramps. It includes West Burnside, and it also includes Southeast Powell. And this is largely, not Powell, Southeast Foster signals and lighting upgrades. The Cornfoot, it scored fairly well in our business case evaluation tool that we use. It's really just a matter of limited resources. And there were about $8.9 million in requests made this year for capital set aside funding, and we were able to fund only 4.1 million was available. And so we actually included, because only 4.1 million was available, but we're actually recommending about 4.7 million in funding for PBOT for the 3 projects that I mentioned. And just given we wanted to make sure we were funding the entire West Burnside project because of the safety benefits that would provide to that stretch of road. So yeah, that's the thinking behind that.
Peabot, do you have a response?
Yeah, I think we would agree with Shannon that all of our projects are special, but certainly this one where we will also look for other funding sources in terms of working with the freight community, because it's an important one, but it's one of many important ones. So I think we, given the recommendation, certainly the safety benefits, as Shannon referred to, are really important for us, and so we will continue to find a way to pay for Cornfoot Road. But it's a long list of kind of many important projects we're working through.
And does Cornfoot cost 2 million or 10 million?
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's 10 million, but the 2 million would be, because as Chris mentioned, it would be funded through heavy use vehicle tax. So the total estimate is about 10, and 2 million would be the capital set aside portion to fund that work.
So for that 8, does council make the decision about what happens to the other? There's a $2 million ask here and a $10 million or an $8 million ask. I think the $8 million comes out of the heavy vehicle thing. Is that a council decision, or is that something else? Or does someone else choose to make
I think there's actually, we can dig into that. I think it follows kind of a recommendation we have from like the Freight Advisory Committee in terms of how those funds, but I think any of our capital projects would come forward as a budget ask for council eventually. Yeah, but there would be a recommendation working with our community partners.
Thank you very much.
Kevin, and then Commissioner Ryan.
Morning. Just a couple quick questions. One, you guys use lots of acronyms that I am not keeping up with, so it's just something to think about. And 2, I recently got my tags. I guess it's a way to explain this. Went through emissions and all that, and I saw a new tax this year, and I couldn't remember if it was city or county. And it almost kind of doubled my fees. But are those dollars used in Peabody, or are those county taxes and not city taxes?
Yeah, I believe that is additional on the vehicle registration fee. That is the county. Okay. That is dollars that go to the county. We don't get any piece of that. That's all county, and that's going towards kind of their bridge replacement work. The first surcharge they had went to the Selwood Bridge, and then the additional work, I think will be going towards the replacement of the Burnside Bridge, is my understanding.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Commissioner Ryan.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Director Warner. Great presentation. It's hard for me not to go into the strategy place because I do think that's connected to budget, but I'll try to stay in the boundaries of the discussion today. When you had on slide 9, the derelict RV program, and then the cleaning up camps, those are some big numbers. And I really just want to educate myself and the public on how the houselessness crisis that we're dealing with spreads beyond, into many bureaus. And you and I had that conversation, I think, when I first started in an onboarding meeting, when I asked the bureau directors how this was impacting their workflow, and everyone had a lot to say, including you. So I'm not surprised, but I want to understand a little bit more about those price tags. $652,000 with derelict RV. What work is involved, and then what other bureaus are we working with on both of them? Because I couldn't tell if it was specifically Peabody that is incurring this expense, and then to what end. So with that big expense, what action takes place that I think we need to understand that better. At least I do. And since I oversee the joint office, I'm really particularly interested in this question. It was slide 9 that you had up.
Yeah, I can speak to both of those. The first one is in terms of the derelict RV program. I think this was initiated with Commissioner Saltzman. What we found is there were many RVs that were in the right of way that had become hazards for the community, whether it was needles or sewage or things like that. So what we have found is that no one will take those, right? No one will take them for you can't scrap them. So what we actually do is we work with like some of the outreach providers to talk to people and trying to figure out what their situation is. Maybe we can find some additional resource for them. But at some point, there are some that are derelict and need to be dismantled. And so as part of our city strategy, we go ahead and take those and have them demolished. What we had found is if you just towed them to a lot, sometimes what would happen, somebody would get them and they would be back out on the street before you even know it. They would tow them back out on the street. So in order to get the worst of the worst is what we call them, we go ahead and pay for them to be dismantled so that they don't continue to be on the street. This also pays for our teams that go out there and work with folks that are actually on the street. So our parking enforcement, we have a kind of a vehicle inspection team that goes out and works with people in the community to see exactly what we can do to support them in terms of whether it's bringing in other partners in terms of getting them kind of the assistance they need. So that's been a big element of it. And in terms of the dollars that go towards cleaning up, that is money that is assessed to us by, I guess, by OMF or somebody that goes to the one point of contact in Lucas Hilliard's group, and they're the ones that do the cleanup. We just actually pay money into the fund.
So Director Warner, thank you for explaining that. I think it's good for anyone that's tuned in. Also, I want to know, was this a rear view mirror like that you discovered that you spent about $652,000 on the RV derelict program last year or something like that, and you wanted to ask for more? Or is this a new request, and is it higher than in the past?
It's actually a little bit lower. At some point, we were spending almost $1 million out of general transportation fund revenues. So this wasn't general fund revenue. This was GTR. This was our money that we were paying in order to help contribute to that. So we've seen like the number of actual RVs that need to be disposed of a little bit less. So we're spending a little bit less in the program because I had to cut back on some places. So we're still getting the worst of the worst. But kind of the backlog that we had to work through is no longer there.
Okay. Well, I think the eye test would say that the problem is pretty extreme. And so it's helpful to hear your perspective and also that there's a cut here coming from you in that area. I will ponder this for a bit. But anyway, I appreciate the conversation and thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, Director Kennard, I think we're ready to move to the next section.
Great. Thank you, Director Warner, and to your whole team. We will now turn it over to Director Rhee with the Office of Community and Civic Life.
Good morning. There's also a slide deck that should also appear on the screen in a second. So just wait for that. Good morning to the Mayor and all our elected officials, Bureau Advisory Committee, city colleagues, and community members. My name is Suk Rhee, and I serve as Director for the Office of Community and Civic Life. Please advance the slide. Today, I will provide budget and operational context and decision points for fiscal year 21-22. And then we will also hear from two members of Civic Life's Bureau Advisory Committee. Next slide, please. On pages 10 to 14 of our proposed budget, you'll see the Bureau mission, long-term goals, and strategic direction. Our impact is at multiple levels through individual programs, the collective impact when programs work together, and then the contributions to shared goals when we partner across bureaus and jurisdictions. This past year, we trained nearly 40% of our staff in results-based accountability to ground our conversations about impact in root cause analysis. And we'll be working to develop a single plan that is both our strategic and equity plan in the coming year. Next slide, please. For budget context, Civic Life's budget represents less than 1/3 of 1% of the city's budget, which makes me very humbled following PBOD and Parks, our sister bureaus that are much bigger than our bureau, but we also work as mightily as they do to serve Portlanders. In our current year budget, you'll see that the neighborhood outreach and support is the largest program at more than $3 million and is funded with general funds, and that has been the case since the Bureau's founding. Next slide, please. In fiscal year 21-22, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that cannabis is the largest program at $5.4 million, and cannabis is funded by licensing fees and ongoing cannabis tax allocations as determined by City Council. This marks the first time that our single largest investment is not the neighborhood program, but at the same time, the cannabis program equally exemplifies our mission of promoting civic engagement. In fact, community leadership and civic engagement at the ballot box and through policy is how we came to decriminalize adult use cannabis. The cannabis program also illustrates the direct connection between economic and racial justice, the imperative to focus on Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities, as well as other minority-owned entrepreneurs. And the program's entire operational purpose is directly tied to restorative justice and anti-racism, a city value. It truly is exciting to see all the forms that the mission of civic engagement have taken in our lifetimes and the way that the Bureau has adapted. Next slide, please. Major issues for the Bureau are found on pages 12 to 14 of our proposed budget. In addition to becoming a more multilingual and multicultural workplace, that's just one aspect of serving a diversifying Portland. We are also investing in our ability to use and apply data and technology and pursuing more intergenerational approaches. This means continuing to evolve our program assumptions and organizational structures over multiple years. Next slide, please. The changes in next year's budget are guided by three things primarily. First, it is in direct response to the impacts of COVID-19 and systemic racism that we've experienced prominently last year. This means no cuts to services to communities of disability, youth, immigrant and refugees, and Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. Second is to reflect strategic choices to invest in the major issues on the previous slide. These include building foundational capacity and technology and the elimination of expenses that carry a high administrative and staffing costs and produce limited impact. And third, we eliminated or reduced quantity rather than quality wherever possible, such as in administrative operations. Next slide, please. You will see a summary of reductions on page 15 of our proposed budget. I will focus next on the 4 requests for ongoing or one-time dollars. Next slide, please. We are actually withdrawing the request for ongoing dollars for rent for a new home for the East Portland Community Office. Under Commissioner Hardesty's leadership and partnership, we are working to find a home for the office at below market rates. In brief, multiple issues require that we end the lease at the Hazelwood Water Facility with the Water Bureau, but since we are pulling the request, I can explain that at another time. If you can advance 2 slides, please. Thank you. We are requesting to add back $251,000 in reallocated general fund resources to double the number of trainings we can provide through our Constructing Civic Dialogues program. These trainings are offered at no cost to community members, and they focus on conflict resolution, problem solving, nonviolent communication, transformative and restorative justice, and civic organizing. This is a strategic realignment that is responsive to the increased stress experienced by communities, as well as increased interest in different forms of public dialogue, especially around race and difference. Next slide, please. This request would double the program investment to $500,000. The total amount would be invested in grants to a range of community partners to deliver the training and facilitation services. And during this past COVID year, even with COVID, we served 2,800 people through this program. This request would double that to 5,600 individuals without increasing administrative costs. On the slide, you'll see just a few examples of the trainings that we currently provide, and they are heavily subscribed to by our neighborhood associations, district coalitions, city advisory bodies, and other community and city networks. And trainings such as these help all of us work better together in public spaces. Next slide, please. Per the mayor's follow-up guidance in January, one-time funding is requested to revitalize our neighborhoods and commercial corridors through the graffiti removal program. Next slide, please. Currently, the program has one contractor for both proactive and responsive removal services. So proactive services include removing graffiti on pre-designated routes that are identified by high and consistent volume. Responsive services are in response to calls from businesses and neighbors, as well as in response to protest activities, as we saw last year. The $530,000 one-time request would go to both proactive and responsive service contracts. We are pleased to announce that this year, we intentionally recruited for more minority, women, and emerging small business contractors. We are bringing on 5 new contractors in April, 3 of which identify as minority-owned. We continue to engage community volunteers in graffiti removal at the neighborhood level. However, it is important to note that contracted services are dollar for dollar, at least 8 times more effective than volunteers. Contractors can quickly remove graffiti from any surface for approximately $1.50 per square foot, and volunteers are limited to specific surfaces with non-technical surface preservation or environmental restrictions. Next slide, please. Finally, per the mayor's follow-up guidance, the cannabis program is requesting $900,000 in one-time cannabis tax resources for a cannabis emergency relief fund. This request, however, will be presented to you in 2 days at the April 1st work session with the other cannabis tax allocation requests, so I will not discuss that here. Next slide, please. That concludes my portion of the presentation. Thank you for your attention. Next, you will hear from Civic Life's Bureau Advisory Committee members, Danielle Franco-Nunez and Elena Gonzalez-Baird.
Good morning, Mayor, Commissioners, City Auditor, City Committee members. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Danielle Franco-Nunez, and I am here as Civic Life's Bureau Advisory Committee member. On the back, I represent city employees that are represented. My normal city position is a community safety coordinator within Civic Life. I wanted to speak about 2 points with you today. The first is the back process. Due to global and local events, the back process was impacted. In the end, we knew we were not going to be able to continue with life as normal. We had to make hard decisions and apply the budget equity toolkit as best we could, causing the least amount of harm. The BAC made the recommendations utilizing qualitative over quantitative model, hoping that we were fully supporting, fully funding programs that advance equity in the community, and protecting the programs that provide direct services to the most vulnerable, historically underserved members of our community. However, any partial funding instead of fully funding places these programs at a disadvantage. But there's no denying that people in Portland and in our communities will feel the lack of city services as a result of the budget shortfall. Secondly, I would like to speak about stipends for citywide advisory bodies. I understand this has come before City Council in 2019, and in February of 2020, recommendations were made to City Council. I would like to lend my voice and the voice of the BAC to the work currently being done by Civic Life, Office of Equity and Human Rights, and HR, to simply say that it is inequitable to have committee members give of their time in the evenings or during work hours in order to participate in these committees. I understand that there are city, state, and federal policies providing stipends and regulations for volunteers, and they have rules set in that. I simply want to say that just because something is local, regional, or federal law does not make it moral, just, or equitable. I strongly support equity in all its forms, and if that means making Portland an inclusive city to the point that we go our own way in making it easier for community members to participate in these committees, then we should. The decisions deliberated in these committees and then implemented by the city as policy affect community members more than those of us who have the privilege to sit in as paid city employees. We believe the city will benefit from a more diverse group of representatives across other committees when it is less of a financial hardship to do so. Thank you. I give the rest of my time to Lena Gonzalez.
Danielle, thank you. Thank you, Director Reed. Good morning, Mayor Wheeler, Commissioners Hardesty, Rubio, Ryan, and Maps. For the record, my name is Lena Gonzalez. I serve on Civic Life's Bureau Advisory Committee. I am a City of Portland employee. However, I am here today in my capacity as a member of the public. Firstly, as Daniel noted, our recommendations, deliberations proved quite challenging. The question arose as to how best utilize the budget equity toolkit, essentially reconcile Civic Life's and the City of Portland's core values when tasked to reduce program budgets, specifically programs that serve our communities directly and align with the respective core values. Indeed, we adopted a qualitative versus quantitative framework in order to ensure Civic's existing direct programs remain intact to the greatest degree possible when faced with budgetary constraints. We opted to uphold and attempted to strengthen these public-facing equity programs. Civic Life is primarily comprised of public-facing equity and community engagement programs for the greater good, and is uniquely positioned to realize these ideals and core values. To that end, the BAC seeks consideration for and recommends identifying programs that are equity and civic-minded, those that provide direct services, and in a sense, allow for an exemption for programs and initiatives that serve our historically underserved residents, our Black, our Brown, Indigenous, our disabled persons, our elders, the socioeconomically disadvantaged, our most vulnerable, our immigrant, refugee, asylee communities, our communities for which Portland has become their sanctuary city. There is a potential formula, a solve in a sense, given Civic Life comprises less than 1% of the general fund as compared to other bureaus, and in which there exists exemptions for smaller bureaus such as OEHR and government relations. We would like to explore this potentiality. In order to ensure equity, we must invest in equity first. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That concludes our presentation.
Very good. Thank you, Director Reed. Commissioner Mapps, and then Frida.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thanks to the Civic Life team for that very informative presentation. First, I have a clarifying question. I know that Director Ree said that she was withdrawing the EPCO add back request, specifically the piece that dealt with rent for the East Portland neighborhood office. There are actually, at least according to the document I'm looking at, there are two pieces of the EPCO add back request. One is for rent and one is for realignment. Are you just taking back the rent? Are you just withdrawing the rent piece, or is there still the realignment piece there that is kind of on the table?
Commissioner Mapps, we are still committed to finding a home for the East Portland Community Office, but we want to find one that's more of a win-win-win situation, not only for the community served and the staff, but also for our budget. So that's why we're trying to look for below market opportunities. So we actually have a one-time, so there will be, with any move, potential one-time cost for a move, and that will be presented through our spring bump request, just to preserve some resources, because any move will require some level of support from the city, such as facilities. And then, but the budget request for the ongoing rent as an add back of the ongoing general fund dollars, that is what we are withdrawing because we believe that especially with Commissioner Hardesty's leadership, we are trying to pursue a different, more affordable solution for the city.
So so are you taking back the $66,000 request, or you, okay, so the whole thing, great. Very helpful. So that reduces the number of questions I have. Again, like I did with my other questions, what I want to do now is to explore differences between what the City Budget Office is recommending and what the Civic Life is asking for. The glaring example here is the Civic Life's request for $251,000 to expand the Constructing Civic Dialogues program. The budget office is recommending $0 for that. I was wondering if the budget office can explain their thinking about that. And then I'd love it if Civic Life had a rebuttal or wanted to respond.
Sure. Thank you, Commissioner. I'm going to turn it over to Angela Butel, who is our analyst assigned to work with Civic Life.
Hello, and yes, thank you for the question. So CBO's recommendation around the Constructing Civic Dialogues request is based on two main factors. The first is just simply the overall limited amount of general fund resources available and trying to consider requests across the city and prioritize the most urgent and pressing needs. Is the first factor. The second factor is that part of CBO's set of criteria that we consider budget requests on includes the availability of strong performance management data about projects so that we can understand if we make this investment, what will be the outcomes, the impacts of making that investment. And currently this program does not have a very robust suite of performance measures associated with it. I know that that's something that the Bureau is working on really diligently right now to revise their whole Bureau-wide performance framework and to find additional data. And that process, I think, will be really helpful to understand requests like this, where there's an investment in the face of a really big community-wide problem like addressing bias and conflict resolution. So that is CBO's thinking for that request.
Great. Does Civic Life have a response?
Yes, well, CBO, we actually agree with their perspective in many ways. We would also still make the case that investments like these are hard to capture in a set of performance measures, especially when you take a root cause analysis and contributory approach. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we are undertaking a more profound investment in how we understand our impact and not just our programs, but our collective impact when programs work together. And Constructing Civic Dialogues actually, so we have process measures, how many people take advantage, maybe some output measures in terms of what they thought about the training and how they might apply it. But you're right, in terms of an investment like that, our ability to actually create impact measures when we don't have the ability to put additional dollars toward evaluation or tracking participants' progress over time, we do need a better suite of performance measures that actually get to how do we get to a more civil society? And how do we equip our volunteer leaders, especially stepping up in public spaces when we've asked them to, as neighborhood association leaders or advisory body members? And so, although we do acknowledge that the ability for the city and for our program to evaluate that is a little bit beyond our reach at this point, we know profoundly what the investments in leadership and training, and especially into facilitation and anti-oppressive practices, we know that there's a whole body of evidence that is out there that we could apply and possibly infer that if we do these things, we will get these other results. But at this stage of our performance measurement tracking, it is a little bit beyond our reach to document that to you.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Director Reed.
Rita.
I want to thank you for the presentation, and you answered most of my questions. I do have one question about one of your cuts to the grants program. In East Portland, with East Portland Action Plan, we have found, especially over the last year, a greater demand in the grants program, especially from our BIPOC community organizations, et cetera. Yet you're requesting cutting this type at a time when there seems to be greater need by those BIPOC communities and smaller organizations. It seems like that's against what we're trying to do with equity. And so a little explanation why it was chosen.
Thank you. Thank you, Frida. That is a great question because it does pain us to have to cut our small grants. That amount is about $103,000. I mentioned that one of our principles for looking at reductions was the cost of administrative and staffing to administer these programs. So for a $103,000 program, that is actually distributed over 7 district coalitions. The actual staffing and admin costs, I would say, is more in many cases more than double or triple or quadruple what it takes to it will cost us $2 or $3 or $4 to get $1 out the door, because we have our level of administration and then it goes to district coalitions. One district coalition, for example, receives about 9,000 in small grants to redistribute. They have another process on top of that, including valuable volunteer hours. There's reporting and there's financial tracking that you have to do for $1, the same as you have to do for $1 million. So the scaffolding of administrative and people investments to administer a small amount of money, that is what that's what we took a hard look at. However, Frida, I would assure you, we're not backing away from how to support grassroots, volunteer-led, small, and communities that come together, identify their own concerns, and lead and offer solutions to the city. We're more than doubling down on that effort, but we have to have mechanisms that are actually that don't cost 2, 3, 4 times as much to administer than what the community is benefiting from. And so that is the reason why we are suggesting cutting the $103,000 in that small grants program. But the power of a small grant to a volunteer grassroots organization, we saw that over and over again during the COVID response. We think that we can work in better ways to deliver that in the future.
Yeah, it seems like you have a process issue versus the need issue. And so it may be diving into that process issue to streamline it to make it less costly. Thank you.
Commissioner Ryan.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Director Reed, for the presentation. So I look at budgets as basically your strategic plan for the year, your map. And so I was trying to find where something is that's very important to the entire city. And it was highlighted, if you will, with the laboratory over the last 6 months of looking at Sweeney in comparison to how it provides services to the southwest part of the city. So as I'm learning, we have these umbrella organizations that serve our neighborhood associations in different parts of the city. I was trying to find what is your strategic plan, therefore your budget map, that is going to allow us to see what your vision is and your action is so that we have a system that we can all get behind. Because what I learned during that example, if you will, that came to the dais was that, and I kept asking for it, as you know, is what's the systemic change that we're going to make so that we have a system that provides that type of support throughout the city. And I couldn't see that in this plan. And it sounds like it's a major overhaul that's necessary. And I just want to hear your thinking on that. And I'd like to know that it's being supported so that we can implement it this year, so we can avoid what was a pretty laborious discussion over Sweeney over the last 6 months. So I'm looking for that. I can't see it so far in this presentation. Could you shed some light on that, please?
Yes, Commissioner, you're a very astute reader of our proposed budget. It is not evident in the proposed budget because we're at this point where we are with the ordinance that was just adopted, was it just last month, to deliver services to Southwest neighborhoods through Civic Life to coordinators. There was also a work session required in that ordinance. And it's really that work session that gives us that breathing room, that opportunity to have the larger, not just strategic, but even I would say philosophical discussions about where we are as a city, the city we want to build back. And so what you see in our and that work session will be led with Commissioner Hardesty's leadership as well. That has not been scheduled yet. And that's going to be our next opportunity as a city and as a council to have that bigger conversation. So what you see in the 21-22 budget is a request to continue and to honor our long-term partners. We've had partners for 4 decades, more than 4 decades in this program. We want to provide the continuity, and we can't see too far into the future with our budget forecast, but we want to make sure that our district coalition partners have the ability to continue services as the city and council takes on the broader conversation. So you are right, sir, that is coming next, the next big conversation will be a work session.
Thank you.
All right, that looks like that's the questions for now. Director Kennard.
Great, so that concludes our planned presentations for the day. I will pause and see if there are any other questions. It looks like Director Warner is still on with us and Director Long. So I want to pause and see if there are any other lingering questions that we didn't get to as we stuck to our agenda today. So pause for a moment and see if there are any other hands raised.
Yeah, I'll jump in and just say, I found these presentations to be very, very thorough and helpful. And I also want to thank my colleagues for doing the heavy lifting on asking questions. A lot of the questions I would have had were thoroughly answered, and I appreciate it. I'll probably have some follow-up questions that really aren't as much budget related as they are policy questions, and that'll help me frame the proposed budget. But good presentations today, good questions that everybody asked. While people are thinking about whether they have any other questions, could you give us some sort of a preview of what's next for us, Director?
Absolutely. So our 7th and final budget work session will be on this Thursday. The theme is economic survival and stabilization with a focus on community and business support. We will kick off the day with a presentation by Prosper Portland, and actually this agenda was set before we knew a lot of details around the federal ARPA resource allocation. What we are planning to do, we've modified the presentation structure slightly so that you will all receive an overview of the previous allocation of federal resources, the CARES Act, and sort of an update on the process that the city is going through with regards to allocating this next round of ARPA resources. And then you'll hear directly from bureaus who have submitted requests that are likely eligible to be funded with this ARPA resource allocation. We're not going to have a robust discussion on the ARPA resources in Thursday's work session, but we have scheduled an additional 2-hour work session on April 20th so that we can dive in a little bit more deeply and have a more focused conversation specifically on the ARPA resource allocation. So this will be sort of an introduction to that topic, and you'll hear directly from bureaus about requests that they've already submitted through their budget that may be eligible for ARPA resources. And then we're going to spend an hour and a half talking about our recreational cannabis fund resources and that allocation. So we have a separate pool of resources that council gets to allocate that have certain eligible uses that I'll go over in the introduction, and then we'll have each bureau present on their investments that they currently have, their current use of recreational cannabis fund dollars, as well as requests for new cannabis fund dollars. So that's the plan for Thursday. Will be kind of a packed agenda, as many of these have been, but I'm looking forward to it, and that will be our final presentation again until we have a more dedicated conversation around ARPA resources.
Great, thank you. Colleagues, anything else before we adjourn? Giving you 6 minutes back. How about that? Thank you, everybody. Great presentations. Thank you, Director Kennard. Thanks, colleagues. Thanks to our Budget Advisory Committee members and anybody else I forgot. We are adjourned.